Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be here with you all today. I'm going to talk about my research, mindsets and management, AI, and gender and equitable access to finance. So I'll walk you through a little bit around background. I'm specifically talking about credit scoring tools in the global South, share a little bit more about kind of the state of what that's looking like, share my methods, findings, and end with a discussion and conclusion. So we've all seen these narratives. AI unleashes opportunities globally. The age of AI has begun. AI for good, solving these global issues, catalyzing education, making the global South more competitive. We're going to get wealthier, more productive, et cetera. Hurrah. And one of the big areas, particularly in low and middle income countries, where we're seeing a proliferation of AI tools is in areas to enhance financial inclusion. So there's about 1.5 billion people globally who are unbanked, many more who are considered underbanked. And these are predominantly, or mostly women, men and women, but there's a lean towards women who are unbanked, linked to various barriers around being able to access finance. So the idea is that AI can help provide credit assessment to people who don't have formal bank accounts or formal histories by providing a credit score based on how people use their phones. So this is a very large market. There's about $11 billion of the alternative lending finance market has been valued at. The expected annual growth from algorithmic-based lending between yet last year and 2031 is almost 26% annually. So when I say growing, I really mean this is growing quite quickly. And especially in countries like Kenya and India, where a lot of my research focuses, 77% of Kenyans have taken out only digital loans. So kind of building off of what we heard from the keynote earlier today, smartphones are a really prominent application globally. So how do these tools work? We all have these different smartphones in our pockets that we carry around with us. Now, these AI tools are essentially apps that people download onto their phones, and they look at all sorts of different data related to how you use your phone to provide you with a credit score. You don't necessarily see the credit score, but you see whether you're offered a loan and on what repayment terms. How do they work? They're predicting creditworthiness, which is defined as your ability to repay and your willingness to repay, largely using your smartphone data. So ability to repay, maybe looking at data such as your geolocation, where are you traveling from? If it's the same location every day, maybe you have a formal, stable job. Your SMS, especially financial transactions, any financial records or consistent income, your call records, what kind of phone do you have that indicates your level of wealth? It's looking at willingness to repay, your behavior. Can I trust you? So this might be measuring psychology and linguistic behavior on your phone. What sort of apps do you have? What are your photos? Now, all of this is fed into machine learning models, and the fintechs are identifying which data and features are most predictive for creditworthiness, and then selecting and reviewing those to include. So when a person downloads an app, they kind of go through that machine learning model that spits out a credit score. So I want to know, do machine learning-based alternative lending tools by fintechs reinforce or mitigate specifically gender inequitable access to finance in low and middle income countries? And in particular, I'm studying fintechs themselves, and I want to understand in what ways do the underlying logics, design choices, and management decisions of machine learning-based lending tools by fintechs embed or challenge gender biases, and how do these choices influence gender equity and access to finance? So a bit of a mouthful, but really trying to unpack the gender biases and the gender impacts of these technologies. So my theoretical foundation is in feminist and post-colonial theory and science and technology studies. In particular, I'm recognizing that technology is not developed passively and that knowledge is situated. Also, there's the social context of tech developers really influence design choices and are embedded in tools. So the concept of techno-feminism. I also employ Ruha Benjamin's understandings of these concepts of do-gooderness, where kind of intentions to do good while not actually addressing underlying power dynamics can result in unintended and detrimental consequences. And also her concept of default discrimination, where by not directly tackling issues of inequities in society, you're by default continuing discrimination. So my methods are semi-structured interviews. What I use thematic analysis and an abductive approach and iterative in my analysis. My data sample is 25 semi-structured interviews with fintechs, data scientists, and leaders at those fintechs, and different recordings and memos. So what have I found? At a high level, the notion is that underbanked people are left out of financial folds due to discrimination and market inefficiencies, right? So smartphones and machine learning opens new opportunities for financial inclusion. That's the ethos of these tools. But there's two core mindsets that are underlying the development of these technologies. First is this American banking mindset. So a lot of these tools, they're deployed globally, but they're often coming from Silicon Valley or have links to Silicon Valley in the US. And they really are tied to this American banking mindset, where creditworthiness is not just about your wealth, it's also about your character. Can I trust you? This is a concept of creditworthiness that's very tied to the US, tied to the American dream. And it was very different than other forms of creditworthiness in the past, like in the UK, where it was more about, does your family have wealth? Kind of, where do you have wealth? Where do you come from? So the idea was anyone can lift themselves up by the bootstraps, right? It's very tied to this notion of the American dream. And then this combined with this other mindset of Silicon Valley, where data is the truth. We should leave it to the machines. This is Bill Fair and Earl Isaac. So creditworthiness in the US in the past was seen as more of an art. You're assessing someone's behavior, your trustworthiness. It was also rife with biases. Well, in the 1950s, Bill Fair and Earl Isaac turned the art of creditworthiness into statistical algorithms. And they automated creditworthiness. And since then, we've kind of seen the continuation of credit scoring over time in our society. So, and within these algorithms, what they are essentially trying to predict then is your ability to repay and your willingness to repay. So it's measuring this level of trust, your behavior. As Amir says, some examples of the variables to arrive at income estimation could be rent payment, could be the location where the person is staying. Depending on the profile's data, we're able to compute the income. The biggest point here is, how do you look at various transaction history to build a cash flow? Then I exactly know whether the income is cyclic or regular. And Kamal, speaking to willingness to repay, are they generally an honest person? That's a very tricky question, because now you're questioning someone's morality, right? The second mindset, data is the truth, leave it to the machines. Dante says, something that we know, for instance, if a customer has more than 12 apps in the finance category, they tend to be more than 2 times riskier than somebody with less than 5 apps in the finance category. Now, how to explain it from a psychological point of view, behavioral psychology point of view, is kind of challenging, because we really leave it to the machines to assess information value. And Amir notes, we don't want to be biased about certain religions, castes, race. We don't ask any of them. We only look at data, and whatever data suggests. I always believe data is the truth, data will never lie. So if data is the truth, we can leave it to the machines to be objective. Now, there's this it's combined with this idea of purpose-driven and profit-motivated as well, which is also a very common thing in Silicon Valley, right? Using technology for good, really purpose-driven, but also making money while doing it. As Jack says, this is an awesome opportunity to use devices that people already have to increase their financial agency and autonomy and give them opportunities they might otherwise not have to get into traditional brick and mortar buildings. And Chris notes, objectivity, realism, execution. That's my mantra. Can we execute well? Can we make money doing it? Now, what this leads to is essentially the idea that being fair or being unaware is the best way to be fair. And so having these models be blind to gender or other demographics is therefore the best way to ensure that they're unbiased and fair. But what this actually does is it leads to a lack of grappling with the ways that data and features and proxies, as well as access to the technology itself, is inherently gendered. Sarah notes, because I'm not using gender in any of our scoring, it means anyone coming onto our platform has a very level playing field with anyone else. You don't have to think at the back of your mind, what if? However, gender can be learned. The various variables are gendered, especially when it comes to ability to repay algorithms. These are things like income, employment status, and sector. So women face higher unemployment rates globally. Women are also more often in informal employment. And women linked to caretaking norms are more often in part-time work, which again impacts their different types of jobs and the level of employment. As Kumar says, we don't train them on gender, but then there's a lot of correlated variables when you look at gender. Income is one of them. Like in India, I think women earn probably 85 cents for $1 that we men earn, right? But more than that, the sort of employment segment matters a lot. And just like patriarchy, they're kind of learning that men are better to give loans to over time. Obviously, we want to be equitable, right? But typically the models are black boxes. So because these models are black boxes, it makes it more complicated to dissect what's actually happening, even though the fintechs are recognizing that gender is still likely being learned. As Prashant says, at a technical level, you know that can still happen, which is not avoidable. It's a preference towards a more stable segment, talking about the gender differences. But Aditi highlights what's at risk. Women's economic opportunities can actually worsen if AI tools are introduced without care. And it can happen in this kind of veiled way, which is the biggest sort of threat, right? So all this brings together the idea of this American banking mindset and the Silicon Valley mindset that are leading to enhanced access to finance overall. However, there's gender differences in who accesses loans and loan sizes. Now, all of this is despite that interviewees also agree that women are better repayers. They're more likely to repay and repay on time. So less credit is essentially going to women. Some of the gaps in Kenya, for example, is about a 33% gap. In India, it's higher. It's about a 57% gap. As Rohan puts it, you'll gravitate towards giving loans towards more male borrowers. So unless you want to make a conscious effort to say more women, it's unlikely naturally for it to become much more gender equivalent. So why do fintechs think that less credit is going to women? There's demand side and supply side factors at play here. On the demand side, less women have access to the apps overall. The medium of the tool is a smartphone, but there's also digital inclusion gaps. More men are more likely to have access to smartphones and internet than women, including in sub-Saharan Africa and India, where my research focuses. Now, less women choose to apply or select lower loan amounts. And then they also note that women can face greater challenges in accessing and using the app, linked to digital literacy differences and financial literacy differences. Now, on the supply side, you have the medium of the tool again is smartphones, and that proxies and futures for ability to repay have gender differences, employment, income, and consistency of income. Rohan says it's more again a social thing. I think for an employer workforce in general, men are more employed compared to women. There are more women who are, homemakers and other things in India compared to men. So that's one piece which kind of skews. Now, if we apply socio-structural explanations, which is the idea of taking understandings around societal structures and applying them to looking at these different factors that inform algorithms, we can see how gender norms and structural inequalities are at play here. So as I mentioned, there's gender digital divides that impacts how less women than men have access to these apps to begin with. There's differences when it comes to gendered household financial decision making. There's differences when it comes to digital literacy and financial literacy. And then the creditworthiness proxies themselves are gendered, as I mentioned, formal employment, level of income, and consistency or stability of income. Now, what's really interesting here is that the levels of gender differences through these apps are different in different country contexts. So as Josh says, the 3 different countries, Kenya, Philippines, Mexico, are all very different. So they have different ratios of males and females. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And I also want to note that all of this is despite, again, that women that all the interviewees largely agree that women are better repayers. As Dante says, there are some local rules that apply globally. If you're a woman, you are a better repayer than a man, full stop. So then why is this, what's exactly happening here? So I'll end with some discussion and conclusion for wrapping up. So algorithms reflect their creators. Algorithms are a result of perspectives and priorities of their creators, which are shaped by cultural and institutional logics. So here we can see how the decisions that are going into how these models are created is informed by these American banking logics around how you're defining creditworthiness, and these Silicon Valley logics around these technologies being objective. Machine learning is objective and data is the truth. So being gender blind is the best way to avoid bias. So here there's bringing back up those theoretical concepts of situated knowledge and technofeminism. And then we also see this belief of objectivity in the machine and data is combined with this mission to promote financial inclusion, that do-gooderness. But it's really resulting in actually a limited critical reflection on the inherent subjectivity in using machine learning to inform and decide creditworthiness and credit assessment. Secondly, belief in the machine's objectivity itself creates and obscures unintended gender bias. So these gender blind approaches are obscuring the existing disparities and failing to directly address the underlying structural inequalities. And so what's happening is there's a masking of the reproduction of power hierarchies through these technologies. So that illustrates the presence of the default discrimination of Ruha Benjamin. And then not addressing the gendered aspects of the technology is linked to this deep belief in the objectivity of machine learning, some avoidance linked to regulations, and a sense that it's not their responsibility to address. We're just lenders. And there's this concept that I introduced of this objective algorithm paradox, whereby believing in the objectivity of algorithms is actually resulting in them to not be objective and reinforcing discrimination and inequity. Third, machine learning-based credit assessment results in gender differences in lending. It's increasing access to finance overall, but not in gender equitable ways, with differences reported that are correlating to levels of gender inequality that exist in a particular country. Now, this tension here is that women are more likely to repay on time and not to default, highlighting a potential discriminatory effect and a market inefficiency. One other thing that I would like to highlight, and happy to talk more in the comments, is that these technologies are also optimizing for profit. They're optimizing for lifetime value, as reported by several fintechs. So in that sense, men are actually perhaps more profitable if they're taking out bigger loans and having late payments. So there's another additional element there. Now, fintechs acknowledge that gender can be learned, but they still adopt a gender blind approach and follow other priorities and ultimately do not tackle these inequalities. And finally, I want to introduce this concept of encoded gender norms, where machine learning is subject to encode gender norms. There are a couple key propositions. Data and features are gendered, as is technology access itself. Not considering the ways that data and features are gendered reinforces gender norms, and prioritizing inclusion while being gender blind can actually come at the cost of equity. And this results in algorithms that encode gender norms that are very hard to spot. And of course, this has massive implications that while gender norms can and do evolve, machine learning tools can actually impede this evolution under opaqueness and veils of objectivity. The extent to which is a relation of the levels of gender inequality in a particular country or context. However, there's an opportunity to disrupt encoding gender norms through gender intentional and transformative processes. So to end with some concluding thoughts, the logics and mindsets inform the development of algorithmic lending tools and lead to gender-blind algorithms that have massive implications related to gender. The idea that AI is inherently objective and when left alone will be fair is both seductive and misleading. The reality is that knowledge is situated and algorithms are instruments of values of individuals, but more so the institutions that design them. And while focusing on doing good is fantastic, decisions and trade-offs ensue. Women as better repayers, but not getting similar loans reveals that the promise of meritocracy under these tools is actually not achieved. So one concluding thought that I'd like to leave you with is that because algorithms are tools and instruments of values, they can also be developed and employed in different ways, including towards more equitable outcomes. So this is actually more of a message of positivity at the end and kind of what's leading to my research agenda around thinking about how we design technologies different with, for, and by women's groups to actually think about new types of technology design and how we can, again, employ these towards more equitable outcomes. So thank you.
We have time for one question. Thanks, this is great work. So with respect to your message of positivity, do you have thoughts about how we can effectively and meaningfully incorporate this situated knowledge in the process to change the design?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I have a whole, my next research agenda plan is working with women's savings and credit cooperatives and to do co-design and employing kind of data feminism of principles. We're really working with them to understand what does creditworthiness mean to you? How would you define and operationalize creditworthiness? And then what would how should how would an algorithm be optimized for and kind of working with them to actually develop a credit scoring tool with, for, and by them. So again, I think that the kind of path forward is really thinking about power and ownership in a lot of ways. I think there's certainly ways that these technologies with fintechs could be tweaked, but ultimately it's still, even just like the concept of defining creditworthiness in itself is not this objective thing. And so those are kind of some things I'm considering, but I'd love to hear if you have other thoughts too.
I can talk about that. Just that, so going from the bridging the gap between getting the situated knowledge, what the women think in that context, and changing potentially the structure of the company so as to enable the power and ownership that can arise from participation. Do you have thoughts from that step?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's like some different things that fintechs can certainly do. I mean, I think first and foremost, we need more auditing, right? Like there needs to be a better, like currently within this space, there's very little regulation, especially in, low and middle income countries when it comes to AI technologies, there's a hesitancy around a lot of regulation. So we need more auditing and transparency. I think within the fintechs themselves, bring it more awareness and recognition that this type of thing could be happening, and how are they actually defining these systems. And then in terms of other ways that like the fintechs themselves could change, I don't know if this is kind of exactly getting to your question. That's something I think is still a bit up in there. But I think starting with auditing and recognition around what's happening and the subjectivity that can be embedded within these is an important first step in making sure that they're actually, perhaps moving towards more interpretable models.